Oh, no, that should be. All right, good morning. How's everybody doing? We'll ring our bell, get close. Yeah, with the weather going from like 30 to 80, that's nuts, isn't it? Yeah, it's crazy. Well, oh, thanks, Linda. All right, well, let's go ahead and come together. And I want to go over a couple of dates before we begin, just to sort of make sure we're all on the same page. Actually, tomorrow's Ash Wednesday. So for us, that begins a season of Lent. We have a service in our sanctuary at 6:30, right after supper. And so it'll, with the imposition of ashes for those that would like to participate. So that'll be tomorrow night. And then hopefully you received, if you're on our mailing list, as in either a member or regular tender, you should have received a letter in the mail from me last week that addresses maybe some of the anxiety that's in our community connected to Methodist churches around the whole concept of disaffiliation. What I'm going to do on March the 15th and 22nd, which is our Wednesday nights, at Wednesday night supper, is sort of go over some of the stuff that was in the letter, but in more detail, outlining timelines, because I think that's where some of the confusion is for some. I think it'd be good if at least one person from your family could come, to one of those meetings. They're going to be the same, all right? So it's not like what happens on the 15th is going to be different than what happens on the 22nd. It's just a couple of different opportunities for people to hear from me, depending on the amount of time or that would be, left on a typical Wednesday night. I will answer questions. If not, what I plan to do is if you have questions from the meeting, to either send them in, email, or whatever. There are going to be other meetings that we have. I mean, that just as the time goes on, and so I'll try to answer those as much as possible. But that's either going to be the 15th or the 22nd. Those are the two. March 15th or March 22nd. It's going to be the same meeting. So, but I wanted to give a couple of dates so that it could maybe fit in the majority of schedules. There's no votes or anything like that. This is just nothing but information. And this is very informal. I actually came to the Miller Wilson class Sunday. So they got a little taste of that if you were in Sunday school this past Sunday. So that'll be March, and I'll be making the rounds through other Sunday school classes and things like that, just as time permits. But this is sort of like a shotgun approach, with Wednesday, the 15th and the 22nd being some of the things that's common or easy for us when it comes to our schedule. I put this down just because if you're late, you normally miss it. But if you have children or grandchildren or anybody that is Easter egg hunting age, our egg hunt is Wednesday the 29th. And so, it's I think it's still going to be up at the old Tyler house. I think the Alexanders live there now. But it's a big Wednesday afternoon before supper, but boy, it goes quick. So, just be mindful, that when we blow the horn, they hunt. And then the last announcement, unless you have any, is Holy Week for us is April the 3rd through April the 7th. Now that'll affect this particular group because we do Holy Week lunches, and they begin Start eating at 11:30 if you want. Then there's some level of music, and then a devotional, and then you can eat again or eat for the first time like around 12:30. But we won't meet on that particular Tuesday because we'll be meeting in the fellowship hall. So let me stop there. Those are just some of the main announcements for St. Paul community. There might be some others that deal with our community that somebody needs to mention. We all good? No announcements? All right, prayer pads going around as normal. You can write down any prayer requests that you have. If you're at home, hopefully you received an email from Betty Hips. I think it went out yesterday morning, if I'm not mistaken. And Betty will take both lists and compile them and then send out a master list tomorrow, most likely. So any prayer requests you want to, or any updates, if you've written a name down, over the last couple of Tuesdays, and there's an update on something, that's good to also let us know. Trying to think if there's another announcement that we need before we begin. As my grandmother used to say, God willing and the creek doesn't rise, right? The creek don't rise, yeah. So we'll finish Daniel today. Thanks be to God. Whew. Fall down. So, and if that's the case, I think a couple of months ago, I mentioned just because of the timing, we have to do something short, just because we don't have a few weeks left. And a couple of those weeks, I'm gonna have to be gone. One is I have to go to this conference that's mandatory for all clergy, and that's on a Tuesday in Tifton. So there's no way that John and I can get around it. But I looked at the calendar this morning. Instead of trying to pick like a smaller book or either an Old Testament or New Testament, maybe the better path would do, since we're in Lent, is do something like the 7 last sayings of Jesus. That's sort of a Lenten devotion, and those are independent of each other than the fact that Jesus is speaking them, and they're all tied to the Passion Week, particularly the very last days of Christ. And some of them the very last minutes, right? So, but I'll list those. I'll give them to Kathy, and then we'll send them out this week, so that we're just going to tackle one each Tuesday. I think that'll give us plenty of time and that'll take us, even with the 1 or 2 weeks that I have to be gone, that'll take us into, I think, like maybe May 9th, which is traditionally about the time that we have our last break. Either the first, second, or third week of May is normally our last time, and then we'll break for the summer. So, does that sound good to y'all? All right, good deal. So, all right, last time for announcements before we pray. Ready? All good? All right. Lord, as we gather in your name for this, we are grateful. We are mindful of our time this morning, our time of study, our time of fellowship. At the same time, we're mindful of the events that are in our community, and the events that are around the world. What we pray, Lord, is for peace, for those places that have strife and conflict and war, and whether that's between nations or whether that's in the heart of a person, we pray for the same end, that somehow in a way, whether directly or indirectly, that you're able to break in and to interact in time and space in our lives. We want to pray for that. And we want to pray for it in a way that brings glory to you. We want you to use us in that process for the privilege of participating in your kingdom with your gospel. We're humbled and mindful of not just the privilege, but the responsibility. So be with us, oh God, we pray. We pray for those that are not here, part of our fellowship, through various commitments, some illnesses. Oh God, we lift them to you. And we ask your guidance in all things. Amen. All right, so the last chapter of Daniel, or the last 3 chapters of Daniel, deal with one vision. Up until then, the second half of the book of Daniel is where we have these visions. And they're apocalyptic in nature, which means that they are symbolic, and normally they're given. Either a person has it, and then there's interpretation that comes with it, or well, that's exactly how it is. There's some level of a vision or a dream that a person has, and then there's some level of divine interpretation. And normally the divine interpretation either comes from a separate vision given by God or from an angelic being. And that's what we have in Daniel. So there are a number of, let's see, there's a vision in 7, a vision in 8, a vision in 9. So there's 4 visions. The first 3 are contained to their own chapter, 7, 8, and 9. The last vision takes up 3 chapters. And chapter 10 is what we looked at last week, and that's really the introduction. And what we have is Daniel is in a state of unrest because of what just the text says, a great conflict. Or, there's different words to describe it, but some level of a great conflict. This is the beginning of chapter 10. And we have an introduction of a speaker. We don't know who that person is, but we think it's Gabriel. And the reason why is because Gabriel in the previous visions was the giver of interpretation. So, it would make sense that even though he's not named, we would make sense that, I think context would probably lean a little bit towards Gabriel. But what's new in chapter 10, and we'll see it also in chapter 12, is we have an introduction of another angelic being named Michael. And if Gabriel's job description is information, Michael's job description has more to do with battle, whether it be protection. But it's fairly clear from the context that Gabriel, whenever Gabriel is mentioned, it normally has to do with some type of knowledge or revelation that is given to a person. You see it obviously in previous chapters in the book of Daniel. You also see it in the Gospels, particularly in Luke's Gospel, where with the incarnation, Gabriel is the one that visits Zechariah when he's in the temple, John the Baptist's dad. Also the one that visits Mary, describing her upcoming pregnancy with Jesus. So we do know at least what's consistent in whenever Gabriel is mentioned, and it's only a few times in the Bible, Gabriel's normally tasked with some level of the passing on of information. Michael, there's only a couple times that Michael's mentioned, Daniel being one. We also get him in the book of Revelation, and it has to do with some level of war, or whether it be protection from opposing forces, or whether it be moving out in a forward type. But so we do have the introduction of Michael. That's really all we get. So there's only 2 times, or just a few times in the Bible that angels are given a name. Daniel being one, Gospels being others. There might be 1 or 2 other times outside of, say, the book of Revelation, but that's really about it. It's not often. Now, it does mention angels. It just doesn't give them names. Here we have names. And we do know from chapter 10 that some level of interaction between Michael and, we don't know who this is, but what is named in the text is the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Now, some commentators would say that is a divine being or angelic being as well, non-human, okay, who's obviously on an opposing side as Michael, or it could actually be the leader of the kingdom of Persia. In this case, it would be one of their kings, like human kings. I think it's safe to say something in the non-human origin. I think that would probably be a good safe bet. But whether or not that's Satan, some Beelzebub, other names, I don't know. I don't think any scholar's ever going to know, but they take stabs at it. But we just know, this is what we know for sure, is that Michael is in some level of contest with this person here, whomever he is. So that's again chapter 10. And then, and we do know, at least we can draw from context, that there is some level of a connection between spiritual world and human world, or divine world and say non-divine world. We don't know what the connection is, and what I mean by that is it's not fully defined, but what we can at least conclude from the passage is that, these, if you want to, I like the term reality. These two different realities are related in some form or fashion. Okay? Now, to explain that more is to move into the realm of, I'm not going to say guesswork because that sounds like you're just throwing darts up against the wall, but it's to draw conclusions that are not fully described from the text. Now that's okay because we do that. So sometimes that's where how we form our worldview. That's how we form levels of theology, because there's some things that in the Bible it's just not as clear or it's not as detailed as what it would want us, what we would want. I mean, one of the questions I ask whenever I read Daniel chapter 10 is, well, what is the connection between Michael, the prince of the kingdom of Persia, and Daniel, and how's that related? I mean, to what level does one influence the other, or this one influence that one? Again, we don't know. We can, from this, at least strictly from this passage, we can draw from some other passages. Most of them are apocalyptic in nature, which is its own genre, which is difficult to interpret because it is symbolic, and the issues of who, we don't know because we don't get the full descriptions, and the issues of when, time, are not described. I mean, like when we get to chapter 12, it's going to say, well, what, 1,290 days or 1,260 days, and then it's going to say 1,335 days, and are those literal days? Is that symbolic for just a season of time? And that's not the first time that shows up in the book of Daniel. In chapters 7, 8, and 9, whenever it gives a time frame, it's not as clear as what we want it to be. Now, that's just the struggle with this style of writing. It's not, it's harder to interpret something like, say, from the book of Daniel than it would be the Gospels, or it would be some of Paul's writings, or it would be some of Peter's writings, just because it carries with it a ton of symbolism. And so you don't know if the writer means for those to be literal, or are they symbolic? So, I mean, we what we do is we then look at the context, other genres of writing similar to this, and see if there's some level of correlations that we can at least draw some level of conclusions, which is what we've tried to do. And the way I've tried to do it over the last few weeks is to tell you of the possibilities, okay? And then, I'll normally I'll weigh in on where I am, but now just because I'm there doesn't mean that you have to be there, or that that's going to be the majority thought, right? So, but we have some of that. And because when we move from 10, which is what we looked at last week, into chapter 11, and we're not even going to read it, all right? I mean, just because it is, one of the great things about chapter 11 is most scholars agree at least on the first 35 verses. Because the first 35 verses, this is where history helps us. Remember when Alexander the Great died, all right, so you've got the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, they're pretty much on the block for the better part of about 80-something years. I think it's 87. And then after Babylon, or the Babylonians, you have the Persians. And the Persians are a larger empire than the Babylonians, and they're in existence for a couple of hundred years. And you've got either Darius or Cyrus. I mean, both of those could be one and the same person. One is a Mede name, one is a Persian name. I think they're the same person. They're not two different people. But then after them, you've got Cyrus's descendants, and then eventually it sort of kind of parses on down. And so the Persians are, the world power in that time period until you have Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great, now you're talking about Greece. So out of Greece actually his father, Philip, he's on the scene for a handful of years, and then he dies, and Alexander the Great takes over his role as general. And within the span of about 10 to 15 years, Alexander the Great conquers all of Persia. And so geographically speaking, you're talking about from Greece to India. All right, so it's a pretty wide geographical space. Alexander the Great dies incredibly young. I think he's like 33 or something, 33, 36, somewhere, but it's fairly young. And he had 2 children. They're murdered. All right? I mean, you know how it goes in politics in the ancient world, or if you've got a son or a daughter, you married the daughter off in order to sort of kind of increase your treaties in your land. But if you have sons, most likely they're going to be killed, or they're going to kill each other. And in this case, they're murdered, which then opens up the door for Alexander the Great's 4 generals to take over. And so they divide his empire into 4 sections. All right? Chapter 11, verses 1 through 35, and this is where most scholars agree. I mean, like a large number of scholars agree on this. At least from verses 1 through 35, describe these 2 generals and their the leadership descendants over the span of about 100 and maybe 60 years or something. And so you have about this north fighting the south, and then there's going to be a little bit of something going on in chapter 11, and then the south attacks the north, and then the north, and then there's a wet, but you can actually lay out. I tried to do, actually. I have a study Bible. This is the best I've seen, and I tried to. You're not going to be able to see it if you're in the back, but this is the best I've seen in doing the descriptions between the 2 different people. And it basically tells you about who the leaders are and from what line are they coming from. And it goes for about 100 and some odd years. Some of the people you'll know, like Julius Caesar and some like that, they all, they're either coming down from this group or coming down from that group. And so for about 35 verses, it's pretty spot on, and saying, okay, the description in the text fits, this person versus that person. And then 20 years later, this portion of the text in chapter 11 fits that person with that person. And it's pretty close. I mean, it's actually remarkable, to be honest with you. I mean, it's just how you can lay out history of between these 2 kingdoms fighting each other, and then draw some of the symbolic connections from the text and go, wow, this pretty much is spot on. So for 35 verses, pretty much everybody sees this historically. The struggle comes in verse 36, and then 36 through really the rest of chapter 12. Because what we don't know, or at least what's more difficult, is because in chapter 11, verses 36 through, it ends at 45? That could be about someone we mentioned previously, Antiochus IV, or it could be about somebody else. It just doesn't fit quite as nicely as we would want it to be, like those first 35 verses. So some scholars will take this portion here and say it's historically this guy who was about, I don't know how many hundred years, maybe like a couple of hundred years in the future of Daniel. Or it could be, say, small a, someone like an Antichrist, or it could be capital A, Antichrist. We don't know, all right? Because it's describing something that loosely might connect to some of this, but it might also connect to something in the future, maybe our past, but Daniel's future, or it could be talking about something in Daniel's future and our future. Again, the struggle is this: when? And so this is not the first time we've had these struggles, but But that's just, when you look at chapter 11, if you read commentaries on it, it's going to be, most commentators like to be definitive, right? I mean, because it's their book, right? They want you to buy their book. And so they will say, well, it's not A, B, and C, it's D, and it's D for these reasons, and they're giving you where they sit. But then you pick up another commentary, and they're going to say, well, no, it's really A, and let me tell you why, and so if you have a study Bible, they might disagree a little bit, or they might say, perhaps it is, but I don't know. I mean, I don't really read the King James. Yeah. So, so say it again, Joanne. I mean, so I know what you.
Oh, it says the king shall do as he pleases.
Oh, yeah. So,
It doesn't sound like something.
well, so it does to some degree when it describes someone who is normally that is describing someone whose behavior is not in line with God. So the idea is that they do whatever they want to do. King James Version of the Old Testament would say, do what is right in their own eyes. Sometimes you might have heard that. But in these particular passages in chapter 11, particularly verses 36 through 45, you've got language where whoever the person is, they are standing in contrast to God and to God's people. Now, this guy definitely fits the bill. This was the guy that built the big statue of Zeus, put it in a temple, and he stopped all religious activities inside of Israel for about 10 or 12 years. He made Jews eat whatever he ate. I mean, at the point of death. So, I mean, this guy he was not a nice guy. So that's not the first time we've talked about how bad this guy is. So whenever it talks about some level of violation of temple or worship or, doing something against God's people, he does fit the bill. But there are other people as well, right? So, again, we just don't know if it's talking about future to Daniel, past to us, or, maybe future to Daniel, maybe past to us, or future to Daniel and future to us. We just don't know. And, I can go through the different, if people are, what do they call them? Like post-millennials or, I don't mean like millennial, I don't mean like like Connor's generation, but I mean theologically, where, some would say Daniel's describing tribulation, and then is that tribulation for a long period of time, or is that tribulation for 7 literal years? Again, that's where you're going to find all this stuff, or all the, people leaning into whether it's big A or capital A Antichrist, or it just could be somebody like a Hitler-ish type person. We just don't know. And I mean, I don't. I'm always hesitant to tell you something as if it is "Thus saith the Lord," when I'm not sure "Thus saith the Lord." All right. So I mean, I know it's in the Bible when you study it, but on these particular passages, we have to just acknowledge that there's disagreement among scholars who are more learned than I am, and if they're disagreeing on it, then the odds are we're going to disagree on it as well. So, and if somebody believes or holds that these passages deal with Antichrist as in the Antichrist, all right, that's fine. All right, no harm, no foul. I can't tell you definitively whether it is or it isn't. But whatever it is, it's dealing with this great conflict that Daniel is troubled over, and these angelic beings are to some degree with Daniel, giving insight and some level of protection, because that's what we can draw from Michael, is that his assignment is the protection of God's people. I interpret that to be Jews, because that would have been God's people for Daniel. Now, some will say that is accurate, but it might mean God's people in the future. It could be anybody that's a follower of God, and that's okay too. To me, the context is Daniel's not going to know about Gentile believers way off in the future. All right? I mean, he's not going to know about America or the United States or St. Paul or anything like that. He's going to know God's people being his people. So that's where I stay. But there are other people who, would disagree, and that's fine too. So then we get to chapter 12. And I do want us to read chapter 12, and because whatever this is, it only just continues into chapter 12. All right? So if you want a nice tied-off bow, we're going to break in 20 minutes. Probably best for you just to leave because it's not going to be a nice tied-off bow. But it's interesting to read, and I think it's coming to the end of the book. So if somebody would read verses, this chapter 12, 1 through 4. Not all together. All right, thank you. The bold.
At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of darkness such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness, like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of your scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge.
All right, thanks. So a couple of things that stand out in this passage again. So notice where 12 picks up at that time. So the reference is back to these verses. We think that I think that's would be the immediate context, and not even though it's inside the whole vision, but obviously he's continuing the thought of 11 directly into 12, and so that's where however we interpret 36 through 45, that just gets continued into chapter 12. But at that time, there is going to be some level of activity. One, Michael is brought back into the vision. We have him at 10, chapter 10, and the only thing we have at chapter 10 is that when Daniel was troubled by this great conflict, it's 21 days later, Daniel is praying and fasting, and then Michael comes, with, which I assume is Gabriel. And Gabriel says, if Michael wasn't with me, I wasn't going to make it. Or, I was delayed or whatever it may be. So, but now Michael's thrown back into the story. And again, it is described as some level of overseer, protector, charge over your people. I interpret that to be Daniel's people, which would be Israelites or Jews. He's there. Some people, and I think they could be, in line with this. If you were to turn to Revelations chapter 12, 7 through 9, you get Michael. You get how some people interpret this in greater detail. Now, the reason why we're not going to spend a bunch of time in Revelation, because if you pick just one little portion of Revelation out and you don't really have the context, when we could go off into all kind of tangents. The reason why I just mention it is because Michael is mentioned in Revelation chapter 12, and it has to do with Michael and some angelic forces in conflict with the dragon. You just have to put a pin in it, and maybe one day we'll go and do Revelation. But so some people interpret the dragon to be Satan. Some people, it could be a host of different folks. But Michael is mentioned, and he's in some level of battle, conflict, war, and he's at war with those people that are in contest with God's people. Same as the book of Daniel. All right. But again, we don't know. We just don't know the timing of it. But at the same time, we also know that, of course, Gabriel's still speaking, in a few verses, we're going to discover that there are actually more people or more angelic beings than just Michael and Gabriel, because Daniel's going to see two people on the sides of the river, and then there's going to be one person hovering over the river. So that could either be three total, Gabriel, Michael, and one hovering over the river, or it could be Gabriel, Michael, two by the river, and then so one hovering, so it could be five. We don't know. Some people interpret the one that's hovering as having more authority than the others, and so many will liken that person to Christ, that this is Old Testament manifestation of Christ. I put a question mark because we don't know. All right, we just say he's clothed in linen. So your guess. Has anybody got linen on? All right, it's not us. All right, so we're good. But it's all and again, this right here is continued, and you're getting some conclusion to this great time of conflict or this great unrest. Now, what's also interesting about the passage that Gene read for us is this is the first time certain things are mentioned in the Old Testament. All right, somebody want to take a stab at it? What might be mentioned here in those verses that is either the first time we've heard about it in the book of Daniel. I will tell you it's the first time it's in the Old Testament. But what stands out to you that sounds very New Testament that's in Daniel's passage? There you go. The rising of the dead. Resurrection. Which is not an Old Testament concept. Doesn't show up in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, we have Sheol. That's all we get. And then actually, when Jesus is debating both the Sadducees and the Pharisees, you know what's the difference between the two? Theologically? It's resurrection. Yes. Yep. Sadducees did not. Pharisees did. So, but here in Daniel, and it's actually, I think, the only time in the New Testament where it actually talks about resurrection like this. And you have who's being resurrected? So it says, all right, verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. So the people who are asleep, which is a euphemism for dead, they awake, which means they, come back to life, consciousness. Some to what? Yes, ma'am? Oh, I thought you said Shane. I'm sorry. So I don't have my left hearing aid in, so I'm all in trouble. So some to everlasting life, and then some to what? Yeah. So who's resurrected? The good and the bad. Both. Not just the good. And the ones who are resurrected are the people who are asleep. Now, Paul would tell you those are the people who have passed, right? In the Bible, sleep is the euphemism for those who have died. But Paul, I think in 1 Thessalonians, I wouldn't have you ignorant about those who have fallen asleep. I think it's like chapter 2 or chapter 4. So there are these folks that have died asleep, and they're resurrected. We know that some, we're assuming good, they go to eternal life, right? And some go to eternal shame. Not Shane. Right, so not eternal shame, eternal shame. But both are resurrected, and there are some who turn. Then it says. So let's just keep going on verse 3. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. We can take a stab at that, but that's symbolic language that we don't know 100%. Other than the fact that you've got that there is some level of turning of others. Now, whether or not they're those that are dead, or whether or not the speaker is going back to alive people who've never died, that we don't know. That's where the wording, we sort of lose track on who's the subject. But there is, to some degree, levels of change, right? Regardless of the who, what happens is that there's some people, they are instrumental in turning others to good. Would you say that's fair? All right. So again, what we're doing is just acknowledging what we do know about the text. We know that there's resurrection, both good and wicked, or good, some that go to everlasting life, some that go to everlasting shame and contempt. And we do know that there are those, again, we don't know who the those are, who are wise, and their wisdom is such to a point that it's influential. They shine, right? And then those who also, it could be the same people who are wise, or it could be a different set of people. There are those who are helpful in turning others to righteousness. That's what we do know. At some point, either here, or way off into the future. And then we get this wording from Daniel, or from the angel that tells Daniel to shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end. That is not a rebuke, nor is it that Daniel is supposed to seal it and then stick it in the corner and nobody know about it. In the ancient world, sealing up of a book means that it's fixed and the wording can't be changed. And so what they would do whenever, like a king or somebody would say, seal it up, they would then make a copy of it, and the copy or the original would be in the records, like the library, and the others would be used if needed. But the idea is that because the copy's been made, no wording of it can ever change. That's what it means by the sealing up, not that nobody should know about it, or that somehow Daniel just needs to keep it to himself and kind of be done with it. So there's some stuff that we don't know, but there's some really interesting things that are important. Obviously, resurrection, first time it's mentioned. And it's resurrection that has some level of judgment to it, right? Because some eternal life, some to eternal shame, and that this is pivotal, okay, and important. And that whatever this vision is, it's fixed. It's not to be changed. Many shall run to and fro, or here to there. I'm not sure what Gene's wording says. And knowledge shall increase. Again, that just describes that. We don't know 100% what that means, other than the fact that, again, there's some level of change that can take place. Either people are turned, knowledge is increased. The here and there, to and fro. It's just not fixed.
So it's now already decided and known if everybody's gone?
Yeah, so you ask a question that we can't, which is a great question to ask. Because that's be one of the questions would be, okay, who is this? When is this? And are these things like completely fixed? We don't get the answer. And so, if there is changing, so you have to ask, okay, to what degree is change predetermined? Is it like Shane is in the wicked camp, or part of those that need some help, and then somebody who's shining bright as the sun, or who has a fair amount of influence, it's predetermined that Shane will change, maybe, or it could be that that's not predetermined and they change, and just well done the person who has influence, and well done Shane, because now he's no longer at eternal shame, he's now eternal life. That we don't know. Now, I'll tell you where I land. I don't land on the predetermined stuff. Because I think there's a difference, and now we're going to leave Daniel to some degree, and we're going to talk about two larger themes in theology. You have with God the idea of omniscient, all-knowing, all right? And so part of that would be foreknowledge. Can God know things that before they happen? All right? So omniscient would say yes. That doesn't mean causation. All right? So, I mean, if I know that if little Johnny or little Susie plays in the street on Wildwood Avenue, I know they're going to get hit by a car. Now, do I cause that to happen? So, we have a tendency that when it comes to God, that if we think or if we assume or believe that God does know, then somehow God causes all. And that's where I think we have to think about both of them and realize that there's not the close connection that we would want them to be, as in one means the other. All right? So, because to do that, then the whole concept of free will or human agency is removed. And so some people would say it's not removed at all and everything's predetermined, even righteous acts and wrong acts. Some say, well, it's only the good acts. Some, because all they're doing is just sort of parsing the verb down. But it still sits inside of the camp that if foreknowledge means causation, then to what degree is there human agency of freedom? Well, in my theological worldview, I think one of the great things that God has done has given human beings freedom. And I think that's what it means to be created in the image of God. Well, then, because that is pretty strong in my theology, and you can justify both, both sides have a little bit in the Bible, right? So then I do not tend to make that step from foreknowledge into causation. I mean, I think there's just degrees of freedom. Now, it doesn't mean that God doesn't inject himself into time and space, because he does, right? But it does not at the extent or the removing of human freedom. Now, John Calvin would disagree with me. And John Calvin was a very, very smart guy, So, John Wesley would agree with me, right? Or I should say I agree with John Wesley. But, it's... and this is some degree what sort of sets certain denominations, there's disagreements there. I think there are some things, I think what's been predetermined is the means by which salvation comes, which is Jesus Christ.
And I don't think of that as exactly like
Mm-hmm.
that. I think
Sure.
of it that God doesn't tell us what we want. Make it happen what we want. I think he sees fully how we are,
Mm-hmm.
and he knows the decisions we make. But
So,
doesn't mean he makes them.
yeah, so you would agree with me then, or I would agree with you. So the idea that there can be, no, there could be foreknowledge, God would know, but God doesn't cause, right? So now I have a whole different, there's another part to this that we're not going to go down because I don't have enough time. And, this is where like John Few and I disagree on the whole concept of time with God and grace, but that puts me in the camp of not a small group and not a majority. So I'll save that for after the lesson if somebody wants to wait. But what you were saying, Joanne, is causation. I mean, knowledge doesn't necessarily mean causation. That God can know, but yet still give freedom for a person to act. And there were some things that Jesus didn't know. And even from people that surprised him. So, I mean, there are times in the Gospels where somebody's response to either Jesus or something that God was doing, I mean, Jesus is like, I haven't seen anybody like this. All right? So, I mean, that's just an example, but I think there are, what the Old Testament seeks to do is in describing God's sovereignty, then, it gives the the appearance as if God even caused bad things like sin. And I mean, when you just look at that from the larger scope of the Bible, we're just drawing. We need to take a larger scope of context. But I have a tendency to stay away from foreknowledge or omniscience ends in causation. So for me, if there are people, the idea that people can change, that things like that, I think that's to some degree God creates the environment, and then it's up to the person to respond to whatever the environment is. But that's good. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so there's two views in the New Testament. You have both views. I mean, you have Paul saying, for those who have gone to sleep, the majority view of the New Testament, and because the Old Testament just doesn't talk about it, you just don't have a lot with it, all right? So it's not that the Old Testament is exclusionary of it, it just doesn't address it. There are two views in the New Testament. One of them is that upon physical death, absent from the body, present with the Lord, that it's instantaneous. The minority view is this concept of sleep. And that's also in the New Testament, where you have people who die physically, and then all they know is, that the next moment of awakened consciousness, whatever, is with the Lord. But it's like taking a nap. When you go to sleep, and then, you have your last moment of, okay, I'm asleep. You don't know what goes on in those, for some, 3 hours, 5 hours, 8 hours, however long you're asleep. And then when you wake back up, it's like, oh, yep, then I'm back at it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it is plausible and possible. So, there's the only way you're going to know is die. Well, I mean, so there is enough evidence. So how do you? So when it comes to the Scriptures, what you do with the Scriptures is, because some of what the Scripture talks about you haven't experienced. So what's given is through what we would call revelation. So revelation is, that involves thinking, that involves spirit experience. But until it actually is fully experienced, there's a degree of faith that comes with it on everything, right? So, I mean, even like with, you mentioned Jesus and the criminal on the cross. We weren't there. So the only two people that experienced that was Jesus and the guy, and then tangentially the crowd. But the only two, so what we do is we trust the source that has recorded that for us, but there is a level of faith that we take in, or that we bring to the Scriptures, that what the Scriptures say we believe, because we trust the one that's behind it, God. So it's if you're looking for certainty on everything, even the things that talk about on the Bible, you're not going to get it. And I don't mean that that is just, you're going to have to come to grips with the role of faith, which is faith. I mean, faith takes things that could have certainty assigned to it, but at some point, it's tested over time. And now, obviously, the ultimate test when it comes to dying is that some person has to die. I mean, outside of that, what we get is from, and we don't get scriptures of people who have died and then come back and say, oh, yeah, I did it. This is what it's like. Here, let me write it down. No, what you get is what we trust in Revelation, how God informs another person about things that person is not aware of or doesn't know. But there are two schools of thought. One is the majority view, which is absent from the body, present with the Lord. Now, there's scriptures that talk about that. There's larger church teachings that talk about that. But there are a few examples. They are not many, but they use this euphemism of sleeping. Well, I mean, that could be, I mean, so what? So you take the analogy. Sleep means that there's a portion of time where you were not asleep, then a time that you are asleep, and then time that you are awakened. And so, there could be that possibility of time frame. Now, I lean on the absent from the body, present from the Lord. There's more scriptures that are signed to that, more examples of that. So I think that's, I'm just from the context, I'm making it up here. If I got 7 verses that talk about absent from the body, present from the Lord, and 3 verses that are about sleeping, I'm going to lean into what the majority of it is. I mean, there's various reasons for that, but to me that makes more sense. But on one level, what's it matter? I'm serious. I don't mean that tongue in cheek, but I mean if it's in God's hands, what's it matter? I mean, again, I'm not trying to, I think these are real questions to ask, and I'm not trying to move anybody away, but behind both of those issues, whether or not it's instantaneous or whether or not they're sleeping, both would agree that there is one behind it all that has got all of that under control, which is also part of apocalyptic writing, because what is stressed, even when we don't get the answers that we want on the who or the time, what is crystal clear is the sovereignty of God. And the sovereignty of God and His care for His people in times of conflict are it's a means of encouragement for God's people. But we don't know for sure, particularly on that issue that what Harriet asked about the question, we don't know which one that it is. And so, I mean, it's not that I think people are trying to be deceptive, and I know that's not what you're saying, but we don't know for sure, because that's also not just, the only time that the question is really asked is when Paul responds to the Thessalonians. Because he said, I wouldn't have you. So Paul gets information from that congregation, like questions, and so he's writing back with the answers. And one of those answers, is, I wouldn't want you to be uninformed. Actually, the word there is ignorant. Uninformed about those who have fallen asleep. And the idea is, there will be a day when they're not, because Jesus has got them. That's actually the paraphrase of the text. And so grieve differently. Not grieve without any hope as if to say they're annihilated, but grieve in the sense that they sit in some form or fashion under the auspice of God, and at a future time, it's all going to be good.
So if this is saying that all go, or then does that mean that the people that are going to go to hell are going to go and into this sleep, and then when?
So we don't have hell in the passage. So now we're making a jump. Okay? So, I mean, all we have is eternal shame, right? And what is it? Eternal shame and contempt, right? So, everlasting shame and contempt. We don't have hell, right? So, it's future looking, okay? So, whether or not they immediately go and then they're taken back out, nobody knows, all right? So, I mean, and those are the two different schools of thoughts. One is that this is where we get purgatory from, all right? Is they're in a holding place, okay? And not to mean that the holding place is bad, but we're in a holding place. And then in final judgment, then you have the separation from the wheat from the tares, right? And then there's some that is their holding place for the good, holding place for the bad, and then final destination for the good, final destination for the bad. So again, we just don't know. We don't get that information because we don't know what paradise is, the verse that you quoted. We don't know what Abraham's bosom is, right? I mean, that's another passage that says, between the Lazarus and the rich man and Lazarus the beggar, he dies, rich man dies, and one goes to Abraham's bosom, which sounds pretty good, right? The other one goes to a place where he's burning, right? Where we don't get it. It doesn't mention the name. And then, but they can see each other because there's a great chasm in between. Now, is that literal or is that figurative? I don't know. And,
When my mother died, or they told me she was dying, and she had been without food and water for many
Sure.
days, and then all of a sudden, she wakes up and is eating breakfast, and I said, "Where have you been?" She said, "Oh, it was beautiful. I can't wait to go back."
Yeah. So, I mean, and I've seen, I'm sure y'all have heard of testimonies, maybe witnessed that. I mean, death is a part of my job, right? So, I mean, I've seen that multiple times. And I've even seen on the last moments of people drawing a breath, they are fully awake. They're just awake in a different, they are interacting with something that I cannot see. Now, that could be, some people would say, well, it's wish projection. I mean, I don't care what they want to assign to it. They're interacting, all right? So now, no, I'm not interacting with them, so I can't describe it other than I've heard people describe horses and describe the beauty of land and people that they see and things like that. Now, what I take from the Scriptures is that this is just an outside verification of what the Bible either tells me directly or what the Bible infers. And so for me, that's enough, right? But until it's me firsthand, I mean, there's going to be a degree that I'm going to have to take some of this with levels of faith. Now, faith doesn't mean blind, let me just jump off a cliff and hopefully there's a net that's going to get me. Your faith can be based on evidence and support, Bible being one, personal experience being one, things like that. So it's not just we're just walking around as if to say, well, really, we don't have any levels of support. No, you got them. But it's not, some of those steps of support are pretty concrete. Some of them, it's like you step on a rock in a lake and they go down just a little bit, and you get your feet wet, but they're still their support. And, but when the issues of death, there is a majority view that's overwhelmingly majority. And if it wasn't for something like this in Daniel or Paul's writings, then we wouldn't even get the sleep aspect. But it's in there. So, we speculate on what Paul meant. So, and so that's where you have your schools of thought. But, in the end, and I didn't mean this, I really meant this in all sincerity. If God is watching over both, I hope that's enough. I hope that, because I'm going to want that, right? So, but if someone is asleep, then they're not aware of the time. So, and time is a human concept, and so it could be that Paul is just trying to help people understand, the time aspect of when someone dies physically, other people are still living physically, and then the whole concept of future judgment. And so maybe he's using that example to say, well, sleep is the best human understanding or analogy that we have to explain, because there is moments of physical death, others aren't physically dead, and then there is obviously future judgment. So is it going to be a one and done judgment, or is it a judgment that's going on always and continually? And for God, it's all happening at the same time, but for us, we segment it out in time concepts just so that we can try to understand it. The last part's in the deep. That's, you got to sit and think about this on a larger scale. But again, those are just to your good on you. You ask a question that we all ask, and it's the answers that we want so definitively. We just don't get them the way that we want them, and that's I don't think that's where for Daniel, for Jesus, contemporaries, for people in the ancient world, they didn't have the same assumptions that we do. So, they're when the scripture is being written, it's written inside of that context, right? So for us, I mean, Daniel had no clue of what was going to take place, 3,000 years after him. He got a little bit, right? But I guarantee he couldn't have thought of in 1969 there'd be people on the moon. I mean, he thought the world was flat, So I mean, and the moon was made out of cheese, right? I mean, so I mean, there are just some things that he lives inside his world. God interacts, and and they kind of go on. I know we had to take a break, so let's take a real quick break, only for about 5 minutes, all right? Because we want to finish this today. Oh, yeah, let's go ahead, and I know we're cutting short the break. Oh, excuse me. All right, we'll come back together, and because there's one last confusing part of Daniel that we need to, just one that we can kind of wrestle with, and then we're going to put old Daniel to bed, let him rest in peace. All right, so let's pick it back up in verse 5. I'll read, and we're going to go through the rest of the chapter, so it's 7 verses. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, 2 others stood, one on the bank of the stream, one on the bank of the stream, or it could be river in your Bible. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. So just notice that now we have 3 people. Now, we don't know if Daniel this is just wrapping up the last part of the book, and not that this is a separate vision, but that this vision of 10, 11, and 12 comes to an end, and then, you know how like when you watch a movie, and the movie ends, you got the credits, but if you keep watching to the very end of the credits, there's like another little piece that comes on for about like 10 seconds. We don't know if this is like a 10-second deal after the credits, or if this is all part of the continual same vision. But with verse 5, you have the language, then I, Daniel, look. That sounds like 10. When the first vision, chapter 10. Normally when a vision or a change in vision is going to take place, you have that type of language. I, Daniel, was on the side of the bank, and I saw, and I saw, X, Y, and Z. Or if it's just a continuation of this big vision of chapter 10, 11, and 12. But we do know that either in the continuation or the little segment after the credits, there are now 3 people or 3 beings. And we don't get their names. We just say one's on the stream, one side of the bank, one's on the other side of the bank, and then there's one that's hovering over it all. That's what we have. And then there's a question. So someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, most likely one of the other angelic beings, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? Again, we have this issue of time. Verse 7. And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand towards heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and a half time. And that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. I heard, but I did not understand. Boy, that's an understatement, isn't it? Then I said, "O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" And he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. And from that time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days, 45 days after that period of time. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days." All right. So what is that about? Again, so let's talk about what we do know for sure. We do know there are 3 beings. One's on one side of the lake or the stream. One's on another side, and there's one that's hovering above, and we don't know who, but it says the man, so we're assuming that could either be somebody that's with Daniel. Most likely it is not. One of the beings by the lake or on the bank of the river asked the one clothed in linen, when is this going to be over, or how long? And then we get this whole concept of it's going to be a time, or a time, times, and half a time. And then you've got some numbers that are assigned to that, but there's two different parts. There's the 1,000, there's 1290, and then there's 1335. What makes this difficult, as with some previous visions, is that the when that this takes place is difficult to describe. Obviously, it's future looking. So whether it's future looking here, or even some other time in the future, again, we don't know for sure. I think it's not this guy, I will tell you that. But it's sometime in the future. And then where most of the conversation is around this idea of the days. And, 1,290 days or 1,335 days, 3.5 years, a little bit over 3.5 years. Are those literal days? I tend not to see that. That's just me personally. There are some who see it as literal days, 3.5 years. A full time would be 7. 7 years, 7 days. So half of that means it's just half of a full time. That's how I interpret those numbers. But there is at least some level of where there still is this level of conflict, and conflict that involves God's people. I think Daniel's talking about Daniel's people. There are others who disagree and say it's about all God's people. I'm okay with that. We don't know for sure. And that for whatever time, it's going to be a time of conflict, but the conflict comes to an end. Now, we can jump into the weeds and try to figure out what, when, and is it literal 3.5 years, or is it not that, or whatever. I'm just going to tell you, you're not going to get the answers that you want them as concrete as you want them. But there are schools of theology that lean into both sides of that, and you might fall in one of those camps. And if so, then hey, that's great. But we don't know. But what we do know, and I want to stress this, because this is everything that shows up in the book of Daniel, whether we're talking about it from the historical side, as in the first 6 chapters, or whether we're talking about it from the vision side, which are the 7 through 12, the sovereignty of God is never questioned. Never questioned. And it's in every single chapter, either in providence for Daniel and the 3, or the giver of insight and information. Whether it comes from Daniel prays about it and he gets his answer, prayed to God, God gives him the answer in prayer, or whether it be the information is given from angelic beings that are dispatched by God, it's still the same. The sovereignty of God is what drips on every single page of the book of Daniel. At the same time, the visions have to deal with some level of conflict. Now, there are times where we have a pretty good idea from history what the conflicts are, but there are a few, which we've talked about today, that we just don't know. They don't fit perfectly in history, or they could fit in a few different eras of history or times in history, or it could be something in the future. We just have to be comfortable with that level of anxiety. But if, I would encourage you to, Google up different schools of thoughts on this if you want, or grab a couple of different commentaries, because they'll line out why they think it could be he's describing this conflict, or he's describing that conflict, or he's describing something that's going to be in the future, way off in the future. That's welcome to biblical scholarship, right? And you are, right? Because that's why you study the Bible. And regardless of the time, the sovereignty of God is fixed. That's not up for debate. And because of that, then whatever the conflict is, what is also true in every aspect of the book of Daniel is that encouragement for God's people. Whether we looked at it in the historical side of Daniel, where Daniel is engaging either Nebuchadnezzar or he's engaging, Darius, it doesn't matter. Or even if it's in the future, What's promised even in these visions is that God cares for his people in some form or fashion. It's not always the way Daniel wants it, which is important to realize, but still care nonetheless. And those are the things that we can easily take from the passage, regardless of how we might interpret some of these more ambiguous type, parts of the vision. So be of good cheer. No, I'm serious on that. Why? Because he has overcome the world. And that is, that I would argue, regardless of where someone interprets some of the smaller aspects of the book of Daniel, we all agree on these larger topics or these larger theological concepts. And I think that's the reason for the book. That even in anxiety or conflict, or even in, because Daniel didn't know everything. It wasn't certain for Daniel. He's asking questions on every single vision. What does this mean? Who is this? I have no idea what's going on. And yet God still just walks with him along every single step. And, and sometimes it's certain for Daniel and sometimes it's not. But, that last little bit is important. Daniel, you just stay the course. And you're going to be remembered. What is it? It's a really cool language. Last verse. But you go your way till the end, which means, all right, we're done talking. You just go on about your life. And you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. Now, the end of days is like end times. That's the last bit. Second coming. And so I think, if you want to focus in on one particular verse, focus in on verse 13. And I'm serious, right? So, what is the product of your faith ultimately? Even if it doesn't, we don't have the answers exactly like we want, the end result, the yield is, I'll be with God. And that's whom I place my trust in. Same for Daniel.
I keep hoping that the people of Ukraine are studying Daniel at this time too. They need encouragement.
Sure. I would take them get encouragement anywhere. You know what I'm saying? It seems. But yeah. So obviously, in places of conflict, for sure. All right. Any other final? We got 6 minutes. So you can solve all the issues in 6 minutes, or you can ask any question or make any comment.
Off the subject, but it's the Greeks that don't rise. The Indians don't rise. I did not know that until
Oh, is that it? Okay. Well, it's not the water. All right. Well, there's an age difference between my grandmother and me. All right. So and so many of those things, her sayings are in my head. I'm like, I don't even know the origin of this thing, but it's there. Yeah. But thanks for telling me that. I appreciate that. So live and learn. All right. I had no clue until today. So thank you very much. She lived. There was a creek behind her house. So I assume that's what she was talking about. I was able to get the old gray mare isn't what she used to be. I did understand that one. So. All right. Go in peace. May the Lord be with you.